selling and working with customers. This is something I learned through doing. This is not my natural domain. I'm not really a very schmoozy person. I'm not really a sales personality. I'm not a big extrovert, backslapping kind of guy that you might make as part of the stereotype of a salesperson. And so I've had to learn this by doing it. Sometimes not very well. I think the key idea in working with customers is that you're trying to connect with their needs, and you're trying to build a certain kind of trust that they want to work with you because it feels more productive or more comfortable for them than working with somebody else. And that involves, more than anything else, being able to listen and to be able to do something for them in terms of creating a solution to their problem that makes them more successful in what their goals are. When you scale it up beyond the question of how do I connect with one customer, you get to an equally important question, which is how do you turn your company into a system for connecting with customers? And really this central question of how do you turn the glimpse of a formula, what a first customer or first two customers or three customers tell you about your product and the problem and your strengths and weaknesses, into something that you can scale into an actual real business. So we're going to talk first about customer discovery, which is really about listening so that you can internalize what their needs are. And in fact, the purpose of going to the customer or talking with the customer is not so that you can get every question answered and discover everything about their environment, but almost so that you are internalizing their needs, their environment, their constraints, so that as you come back into the product development team, you can share that and you can start to answer the little questions that come up moment by moment about, would it be better if we did this feature or that feature? Yes, you can go back to the customer, and that's always useful. But there will always be some set of things that you really want to understand where having an internal model of that customer starts to help you. Now, you don't want to create that internal model in a vacuum. I mean, I think lots of us have ideas about what people want, and it really reflects what we would want. And it's uninformed by actual conversation with the target users. And so they have an internal model and they follow that internal model, and then they're disappointed in their real customers that the real customers don't follow the internal model that you developed in a vacuum. But if you have enough understanding, enough contact with customers, then you can really start to walk in their shoes and be part of the product refinement process that really works for them. So, basic definitions. What's a customer? A person or organization that buys goods or services from a store or a business. Could be online, could be in person, could be a $10 million licensing deal, could be a 50-cent screw at a hardware store, but they're buying goods and services. It's somebody or an organization that needs or wants what you have. So deciding what you have is a big part of this, because you're selecting which person's needs, which organization's wants you're trying to satisfy. And then there's some philosophical points of view. And these last 2 points really come from Eric Panu, who was a great influence on me. I worked closely with him both at Cadence and at Babel Labs to point out a customer is a person or organization without whom you have no livelihood. You are entirely dependent on these. Now, at the beginning, this is a very abstract sort of notion because when you start out, you have no customers, and so you can't personalize it. But it's both a point of view towards customers and a real attitude about the individual organizations that you engage with. And Eric advocates that whenever you're talking about the customer in company communications, capitalize it. You know, make it clear that the customer is king by capitalizing. Oh, the customer wants this, the customer wants that in your internal emails or messaging. Well, capitalize, and it gives you a little bit of a reminder of just how important they are. And it is really this bipolar thought process. One piece of you always thinking about the technology and what the technology could do, and one piece of you always thinking about the customer and how the company exists to work for the benefit of that customer and other customers like them. That forms the axis around which so much of the company is organized. So the first task is, of course, to get in front of early customers, because your first job is searching for product market fit. That is, to identify, is there an unmet set of needs and a set of customers that you can reach that will allow you to make forward progress. And it really is this interlocking discovery, these gears of discovering feasible solutions and discovering customers' problems, and often adjusting what solution you offer to your understanding of the problems, as well as to agree searching for problems, searching for customers for whom your technology is within reach of technically. So what you're doing is you start by going to see possible users. They're often people you already know. Yes, you can just search online for names and make cold calls. That's a feasible process, but it's very slow because people don't often pick up the phone and pour out their innermost needs to strangers. So if you have somebody you know, or somebody you know who knows somebody who has a problem, working the system that way generally works better. And then you're working to understand each customer's workflow process, their existing methods, their frustrations, their joys. You're really trying to get inside the understanding of some aspect of the way they do their work. And sometimes you're focused in on what they do every day, and sometimes you're focused in on particular crises that they anticipate could happen to them. So it doesn't have to be something they're going to use every day. If you've got a security product or you've got a disaster recovery product, you're really asking about something which is a rare event. But the rare event strikes such fear in the hearts of customers that they're willing to talk about it. They're willing to invest to avoid the realization of that disaster. It's important to ask open-ended questions, to really search to find ways to get more aspects of their work. If you narrow the questions to, would this feature work for you at an early stage, you're getting just a simple binary yes, no. And You may not even be asking the right yes no question yet because you don't know what their real care abouts are. And I think it's important to take notes, not only to aid your own memory, but to help as you talk about it with other people on the startup team. And of course, the listening. It's what you hear, what you learn about the problem that's more important than this stage than getting feedback on your proposed solution. This has always been the hardest thing for me. I think this is the hardest thing for many startup leaders because they started the company because they were so excited about some proposed solution. And they are so eager to pull out that slide deck or show that demo about what their proposed solution is. And it really can backfire. It really is so valuable if you stop yourself from pitching for a little while and listen. So you're going to have plenty of chance to talk about your proposed solution, but it's so much better if you can come back and say, I understand you have this problem and this problem and this problem, and we have a sketch of how we might be able to help you with those problems. Can I share with you what our general idea is so that we can understand better what your problem is? So then you come back again to share learnings about their segment, to reflect back to them what you heard. And then maybe you can demo something or talk about something that's a response to their problems. And then you use the discussion of that demo to further refine the problem. Okay, we showed you this. Is this actually solving the problem you talked about, or is the problem different? What is the real problem? And you keep coming back until they say, wow, I can see how this might fit. That would make a big difference. What can you actually deliver? You've been talking about these possible solutions. Now they start really nibbling on the hook. They ask, what can you deliver? Can you make this real? I think one of the things that I'll touch on here, but I'm going to have really unequal treatment, is the question of business to consumer and versus business to business. And the reason is I have most of my experience in business to business. The barriers to entry for business to consumer outside of certain kinds of mass distribution software is actually pretty high. And so it's worth just reflecting quickly on what's there. Typically, when consumers buy things, they cost between $0 to maybe a few $100s. Yes, they buy cars and they buy houses, but those are very specialized areas, and it's unlikely that you're in the real estate business, and not very many of you are going to start a car company. But business to business is operating at typically much larger dollar value, and it's people who represent the company who are making decisions on behalf of their business's wallet, not people talking about their own wallet. So the top end in business to business can be millions or tens of millions of dollars in a transaction, and potentially billions of dollars. I mean, you look at these numbers being thrown around in AI compute infrastructure deal, and they're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, of course, that's not a single purchase. That's a whole plan to develop some future computing infrastructure, which will have a lot of moving parts, but it is really big money. In dealing with consumers, it's usually transactional. You may have some underlying brand trust, but there isn't a specific relationship typically with between the buyer and the seller, which builds a lot of trust. Certainly a lot of real estate agents try to have a relationship in order to understand better and do a better job and smooth the fears associated with making such a large decision. But usually it's something that you could just buy it online and you're perfectly happy with a website that sells it to you instead of a somebody operating a cash register at Best Buy. And you're often selling one product at a time. Sometimes they're clusters of products, things you use together. You buy a piece of equipment and you buy the power cord that goes with it, or the adapter or something else which isn't bundled into it. And in business to consumer, of course, marketing plays a really important role because you have only a transactional relationship at the time of purchase. And so a lot of the background of how something is bought is driven by what they see in advertising, what they hear about from their friends, what impressions they have from reading about things in the press. And so how you get people to come to your website, or how you get people to notice you in the when you're have a kiosk at Home Depot is really a really important part of it. Whereas in business to business, the direct salesperson, what they call the bag carrying salesperson, person whose primary job is to build those relationships and make those sales. And as a result, the timescales are also pretty different. That at the time of transaction, it may only take a few minutes to make the decision to buy or not buy for a consumer product. Of course, there may be months of stage setting with Super Bowl ads and references in social media about some product before you ever get to the store and see it in front of you and you make that spontaneous decision to buy. Whereas the time scale in business to business is a overt and direct sales engagement that occurs over many months. Consumers make decisions with maybe their partner or spouse, maybe completely on their own. It depends on what the price tag is. Whereas the number of people involved in evaluation can be very large. The number of decision makers can be significant. You may have many geographic locations that are involved overall in your business, and even in a single sales decision, there may be multiple locations, and therefore multiple people in those geographies, a consideration of multiple cultural biases, different overlapping and sometimes even conflicting requirements. And so there's, of course, a relationship between the size of the transaction and the size of the team that drives the transaction. Now, sometimes that business transaction is not all inside your company. It's with a distribution partner. It's with an integrator. It's with somebody else whose business is taking raw technology products and turning them into customized solutions at the end customer's site. But that partner is effectively your sales force, and you have to support them and think about them and woo them to make them do that. Customer support with consumer products, it's some combination of storefront and online. Business, people go on site. There are people dedicated to answering support problems. The transaction is big enough. The importance of maintaining the relationship is so critical. The learnings that can take place downstream that influence the ability to sell the next product is so important that support becomes one of the most critical items here. Sure, everybody has to build reliable products that do what they say, but the bigger the transaction, the more complex the product, at least as deployed, and the more critical the support experience is in helping to drive that flywheel of success. And finally, you can think about how many contacts, how many ways, times did the customer and your organization interact. And in a business-to-business deal, it can easily be hundreds of contacts. The number of meetings, calls, emails, online experiences can be really phenomenal. So in the most classic business-to-business deals, you have a significant sales organization that's really about these contacts, because that's what drives trust, that's what drives knowledge of the customer's needs. But they'll suck in other people along the way. They'll suck in technical experts, senior management, your CFO may get involved, even your investors may get involved in this selling process, especially in the early days. I think it's also worth making a key distinction that happens in business to business, which is pretty different from what happens in business to consumer, with a couple of notable exceptions. Because it's often the case that the person who does the transaction is operating on behalf of somebody else. They're operating on behalf of the customer, the one whose experience you're really trying to understand and improve. The most classic case for this in a business to consumer sense is parents buying toys for kids. Here, clearly, in important ways, the kid is the user, but they're not the one making the buying decision. And so the whole art of selling toys is figuring out how to simultaneously appeal to the user and the buyer, the customer and the buyer. So the customer may like it that the fire truck is bright red and it has a button on the package that when you push it makes wonderful siren noises. They can start to picture themselves with that. And the buyer, the parent, is attracted to things like the educational toy, or made from wholesome materials, or something else which supports their notion of parenting. As you deal with both the end customer, the user, and the buyer, you're dealing with a parallel set of issues. In many cases, the buyer is part of a buying organization. They represent the operations team, or they are in the supply chain team, and their job is to smooth the process, but make sure that money isn't wasted, make sure that the vendor is going to be a reliable ongoing supplier. They're going to play bad cop to the user, often playing good cop in that transaction, in that relationship. So you need to understand both of these, because the buyer often the who is orchestrating much of that that relationship in terms of what happens after the user has said, I have a strong interest in this, let's see if we can buy it. Then the decision-making process can often be heavily involving people in that operations and purchasing organization. And so as you're selling to these dual personas, you need to ask these questions like, how is a decision like this going to be made? Who are the people involved in that decision? What triggers a purchase? What can you tell me about the decision criteria that will be used? What's the role of the general manager of the division? What's the role of the purchasing organization? What are the formal criteria you have for putting new companies on your approved vendor list? What are your experiences with buying from startups in the past? You can also get information from others who have sold to the same organization, maybe different kinds of products, but there's generally more uniformity in the way the buying process works from product category to product category. So there's many other people who have sold into that persona who are not your competitors. But then when you're talking to the consumer persona, the user, these are going to be the product teams or the customer success teams. You want to understand how and why somebody's using that product. What features do they value? And sometimes it's direct interviews. Sometimes you have a product already in there and you can look with your customer at the usage statistics to figure out what aspects of it worked and didn't work. And there's a number of references at the bottom of the page, but getting this understanding that there's actually a whole cluster of people involved in the buying process is an important part of starting to understand how you are going to decode what you need to do in order to build those relationships.